And we're going to finish the 54th chapter of Bleak House. Springing in the Mind is the name of the chapter. And we're going to go back to where we cut off last time with Mrs. Bucket speaking. "Since you want to know what we know," says she, "I'll tell you. I helped to bring up Miss Hawdon, her ladyship's daughter. I was in the service of her ladyship's sister, who was very sensitive to the disgrace her ladyship brought upon her, and gave out, even to her ladyship, that the child was dead. She was very nearly so when she was born, but she's alive, and I know her." With these words and a laugh, and laying bitter stress on the word ladyship, Mrs. Chadband folds her arms and looks implacably at Mrs. Bucket, at Mr. Bucket. "My friend the law stationer's good lady over there," says Mr. Bucket, luring Mrs. Snagsby forward with a finger. "What may your game be, ma'am?" Mrs. Snagsby is at first prevented by tears and lamentation from stating the nature of her game, but by degrees it confusedly comes to light that she is a woman overwhelmed with injuries and wrongs, whom Mr. Snagsby has habitually deceived, abandoned, and sought to keep in darkness, and whose chief comfort under her afflictions has been the sympathy of the late Mr. Tulkinghorn. She has of late habitually carried to him all her woes. Everybody, it appears, the present company excepted, has plotted against Mrs. Snagsby's peace. There is Mr. Guppy, there is Mr. Weevil, friend of Mr. Guppy, there was Crook, deceased, there was Nimrod, deceased, there was Joe, deceased, and they were all in it, in what Mrs. Snagsby does not with particularity express, but she knows that Joe was Mr. Snagsby's son, as well as if a trumpet had spoken it, and she followed Mr. Snagsby when he went on his last visit to the boy, and if he was not his son, why did he go? Thus it come to pass that she brought the Chadbands and Mr. Tulkinghorn together, and conferred with Mr. Tulkinghorn on the change in Mr. Guppy, and helped to turn up the circumstances in which the present company are interested, being still and ever on the great high road that is to terminate in Mr. Snagsby's full exposure and a matrimonial separation. All this Mrs. Snagsby, as an injured woman, and the friend of Mrs. Chadband, and the follower of Mr. Chadband, and the mourner of the late Mr. Tulkinghorn, is here to certify under the seal of confidence, with every possible confusion and involvement possible and impossible, having no pecuniary motive whatever, no scheme or project but the one mentioned, and bringing here and taking everywhere her own atmosphere of jealousy. "Very good," says Mr. Bucket. Now I understand you, you know, and being deputed by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, to look into this little matter. "Very good," says Mr. Bucket. "Now I understand you, you know, and being deputed by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, to look into this little matter." Again Sir Leicester mechanically bows in confirmation of the statement. "Can give it my fair and full attention. Now I won't allude to conspiring to extort money or anything of that sort, because we are men and women of the world here, and our object is to make things pleasant. But I tell you what I do wonder at. I am surprised that you should think of making a noise below in the hall. It was so opposed to your interests. That's what I look at." "We wanted to get in," pleads Mr. Smallweed. "Why, of course you wanted to get in," Mr. Bucket asserts with cheerfulness. "But for an old gentleman at your time of life, what I call truly venerable, mind you, with his wits sharpened, as I have no doubt they are, by the loss of the use of his limbs, not to consider, if he don't keep such a business as the present as close as possible, it can't be worth a mag to him, it's so curious. You see, your temper got the better of you. That's where you lost ground," says Mr. Bucket in an argumentative and friendly way. "I only said I wouldn't go without one of the servants came up to Mr. Leicester Dedlock," returns Mr. Smallweed. "That's it. That's where your temper got the better of you. Now you keep it under another time, and you'll make money by it. Shall I ring for them to carry you down?" When are we to hear more of this? Mrs. Chadband sternly demands. Bless your heart for a true woman, always curious your delightful sex is, replies Mr. Bucket with gallantry. I shall have the pleasure of giving you a call tomorrow or next day, not forgetting Mr. Smallweed and his proposal of $250. 500! exclaims Mr. Smallweed. All right, nominally 500. Mr. Bucket has his hand on the bell rope. Shall I wish you good day for the present on the part of myself and the gentlemen of the house? He asks in an insinuating tone. Nobody having the hardihood to object to his doing so, he does it, and the party retire as they came up. Mr. Bucket follows them to the door, and, returning, says with an air of serious business, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, it's for you to consider whether or not to buy this up. I should recommend, on the whole, its being bought up myself, and I think it might be bought pretty cheap. You see, that little pickled cowcumber of a Mrs. Snagsby has been used by all sides of the speculation, and has done a deal more harm in bringing odds and ends together than if she had meant to. Mr. Tulkinghorn, deceased, he held all these horses in his hand, and could have drove 'em his own way, I haven't a doubt, but he was fetched off the box head foremost, and now they have got their legs over the traces, and are all dragging and pulling them their own ways. So it is, and such is life. The cat's away, and the mice they play. Now, with regard to the party to be apprehended, Sir Leicester seems to wake, though his eyes have been wide open, and he looks intently at Mr. Bucket, as Mr. Bucket refers to his watch. The party to be apprehended is now in this house, proceeds Mr. Bucket, putting up his watch with a steady hand, and with rising spirits, and I'm about to take her into custody in your presence, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Don't say a word, nor yet stir. There'll be no noise, no disturbance at all. I'll come back in the course of the evening, if agreeable to you, and endeavour to meet your wishes respecting this unfortunate family matter, and the noblest way of keeping it quiet. Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, don't you be nervous on account of the apprehension at present coming off. You shall see the whole case clear from first to last. Mr. Bucket rings, goes to the door, briefly whispers Mercury, shuts the door, and stands behind it with his arms folded. After a suspense of a minute or two, the door slowly opens, and a Frenchwoman enters, Mademoiselle Hortense. The moment she is in the room, Mr. Bucket claps the door to, and puts his back against it. The suddenness of the noise occasions her to turn, and then, for the first time, she sees Sir Leicester Dedlock in his chair. I ask your pardon, she mutters hurriedly. They tell me there was no one here. Her step toward the door brings her front to front with Mr. Bucket. Suddenly a spasm shoots across her face, and she turns deadly pale. This is my lodger, Sir Leicester Dedlock, says Mr. Bucket, nodding at her. This foreign young woman has been my lodger some weeks back. What? Do Sir Leicester care for that, you think, my angel? Returns Mademoiselle with a jocular strain. Why, my angel, returns Mr. Bucket, we shall see. Mademoiselle Hortense eyes him with a scowl upon her tight face, which gradually changes into a smile of scorn. You are very mysterious. Are you drunk? Tolerably sober, my angel, returns Mr. Bucket. I come from arriving at this detestable house with your wife. Your wife has left me some minutes. They tell me downstairs that your wife is here. I have come, and your wife is not here. What is the intention of this fool's play, then? Mademoiselle demands, with her arms composedly crossed, but with something in her dark cheek beating like a clock. Mr. Bucket merely shakes his finger at her. Oh, my God, you are an unhappy idiot, cries Mademoiselle. Leave me to pass downstairs, great pig, with a stamp of her boot, and a menace now, Mademoiselle says. Now, Mademoiselle, says Mr. Bucket in a cool, determined way, you go and sit down upon that Sophie. I will not sit down upon nothing, she replies. Now, Mademoiselle, repeats Mr. Bucket, making no demonstration except with his finger, you sit down upon that Sophie. Why? Because I take you into custody on a charge of murder. Now I want to be polite to one of your sex and a foreigner if I can. If I can't, I must be rough, and there's rougher ones outside. What I am to be depends on you, so I recommend you as a friend, afore another half of a blessed moment has passed over your head, to go and sit down upon that sofy. Mademoiselle complies, saying in a constrained voice, while something in her cheek beats fast and hard, "You are a devil." "Now you see," says Mr. Bucket. Mr. Bucket proceeds approvingly, "you're comfortable and conducting yourself as I should expect a foreign young woman of your sense to do. So I'll give you a piece of advice, and it's this. Don't you talk too much. You're not expected to say anything here, and you can't keep too quiet a tongue in your head. In short, the less you parley, the better, you know." Mr. Bucket is very complacent over this French explanation. Mademoiselle, with that tigerish expansion of her mouth and her black eyes darting fire upon him, sits upright on the sofa in a rigid state, muttering, "Oh, you Bucket, you are a devil." "Now, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet," says Mr. Bucket, and from this time forth the finger never rests, "this young woman, my lodger, was her ladyship's maid at the time I have mentioned to you, and this young woman, besides being extraordinarily vehement and passionate against her ladyship after being discharged—" "Lies!" cries Mademoiselle. "I discharge myself." "Why, now, don't you take my advice," returns Mr. Bucket in an impressive, almost an imploring tone. "I'm surprised at the indiscreetness you commit. You'll say something that'll be used against you, you know. Never you mind what I say till it's given in evidence. It is not addressed to you." "Discharge, too!" cries Mademoiselle furiously. "By her ladyship, my faith, a pretty ladyship. Why, I ruin my character by remaining with her ladyship so infame." "Upon my soul, I wonder at you," Mr. Bucket remonstrates. "I thought the French were a polite nation. I did, really. Yet to hear a female going on like that before Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet—" "He is a poor abused," cries Mademoiselle. "I spit upon his house, upon his name, upon his imbecility, all of which makes the carpet represent. Oh, that he is a great man. Oh, yes, superb. Oh, heaven. Bah!" "Well, Sir Leicester Dedlock," proceeds Mr. Bucket, "this intemperate foreigner also angrily took it into her head that she had established a claim upon Mr. Tulkinghorn deceased by attending on the occasion I told you of at his chambers, though she was liberally paid for her time and trouble." "Lies!" cries Mademoiselle. I refuse his money altogether. "If you will parley, you know," says Mr. Bucket parenthetically, "you will take the consequences. Now, whether she became my lodger, Sir Leicester Dedlock, with any deliberate intention of that doing this deed and blinding me, I gave no opinion on, but she lived in my house in that capacity at the time that she was hovering about the chambers of the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn, with a view to wrangle and likewise persecuting and half frightening the life out of an unfortunate stationer." "Lies!" cries Mademoiselle. "All lie!" "The murder was committed, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and you know under what circumstances. I beg of you to follow me close with your attention for a minute or two. I was sent for, and the case was entrusted to me. I examined the place, and the body, and the papers, and everything, from information I received from a clerk in the same house. I took George into custody, as having been seen hanging about there on the night at very nigh the time of the murder, also having been overheard in high words with the deceased on former occasions, even threatening him, as the witness made out. If you ask me, Sir Leicester Dedlock, whether from the first I believed George to be the murderer, I tell you candidly no, but he might be, notwithstanding, and there was enough against him to make it my duty to take him and get him kept under remand. Now observe," as Mr. Bucket bends forward in some excitement for him, and inaugurates what he is going to say with one ghostly beat of his forefinger in the air. Mademoiselle Hortense fixes her black eyes upon him with a dark frown. "I went home, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, at night, and found this young woman having supper with my wife, Mrs. Bucket. She had made a mighty show of being fond of Mrs. Bucket from her first offering herself as our lodger, But that night she made more than ever, in fact overdid it. Likewise she overdid her respect, and all that for the lamented memory of the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn. By the living Lord, it flashed upon me as I sat opposite her at the table, and saw her with a knife in her hand, that she had done it. Mademoiselle is hardly audible, in straining through her teeth and her lips the words, "You are a devil." "Now where," pursues Mr. Bucket, "had she been on the night of the murder?" "She had been at the theatre." "She really was there. I have since found both before the deed and after it. I knew I had an artful customer to deal with, and that proof would be very difficult, and I laid a trap for her, such a trap as I never laid yet, and such a venture as I never made yet. I worked it out in my mind while I was talking to her at supper. When I went upstairs to bed, our house being small and this young woman's ears sharp, I stuffed the sheet into Mrs. Bucket's mouth that she shouldn't say a word of surprise, and told her all about it. My dear, don't you give your mind to that again, or I shall link your feet together at the ankles." Mr. Bucket, breaking off, has made a noiseless descent upon Mademoiselle. "What is the matter with you now?" she asks him. "Don't you think any more," returns Mr. Bucket, with an admonitory finger, "of throwing yourself out of window. That's what's the matter with me. Come, just take my arm. You needn't get up. I'll sit down by you. Now, take my arm, will you? I'm a married man, you know. Just take my arm." Vain endeavouring to moisten those dry lips with a painful sound, she struggles with herself and complies. "Now we're all right again," said I, just a deadlock baronet. "This case could never have been the case it is but for Mrs. Bucket, who is a woman in 50,000, in 150,000. To throw this young woman off her guard. I have never set foot in our house, though I've been communicated with Mrs. Bucket in the baker's loaves and in the milk as often as required. My whispered words to Mrs. Bucket, when she has the sheet in her mouth, were, 'My dear, can you throw her off continually with natural accounts of my suspicions against George, and this and that and t'other? Can you do without rest, and keep watch upon her night and day? Can you undertake to say she shall do nothing without my knowledge? She shall be my prisoner without suspecting it. She shall no more escape from me than from death, and her life shall be my life till I have got her. If she did this murder, Mrs. Bucket says to me, as well as she could speak on account of the sheet, 'Bucket, I can,' and she has acted up to it glorious." "Lies!" Mademoiselle interposes. "All lies, my friend." "So lie just a deadlock, baronet. How did my calculations come out under these circumstances? I was right. What does she try to do? Don't let it give you a turn. To throw the murder on her ladyship." Sir Leicester rises from his chair and staggers down again. "And she got encouragement in it from hearing that I was always here, which was done a purpose. Now, upon that pocket-book of mine, Sir Leicester Dedlock, if I may take the liberty of throwing it toward you, and look at the letters sent me, each with the 2 words Lady Dedlock in it. Open the one directed to yourself, which I stopped this very morning, and read the 3 words Lady Dedlock Murderess in it. These letters have been falling about like a shower of ladybirds. What do you say now, Mrs. Bucket? What do you say now to Mrs. Bucket from her spy place, having seen them all written by this young woman? What do you say to Mrs. Bucket, having watched the posting of 'em, every one, by this young woman, Sir Leicester Dedlock, baronet?" 2 things are especially observable as Mr. Bucket proceeds to conclusion. First, that he seems imperceptibly to establish a dreadful right of property in Mademoiselle. Second, that the very atmosphere she breathes seems to narrow and contract about her, as if a close net or a pall were being drawn nearer and yet nearer around her breathless figure. "There is no doubt that her ladyship was on the spot at the eventful period," says Mr. Bucket. "And my foreign friend here saw her, I believe. Her ladyship and George and my foreign friend were all pretty close on one another's heels, but that don't signify any more, so I'll not go into it. I found the wadding of a pistol with which the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn was shot. It was a bit of a printed description at your house at Chesney Wold. Not much in that, you'll say, said I, just a Dedlock baronet, but when my foreign friend here is so thoroughly off her guard as to think it a safe time to tear up the rest of that leaf, and when Mrs. Bucket puts the pieces together and finds the wadding wanting, it begins to look like Queer Street. These are very long lies, Mademoiselle interposes. It is that you have almost all finished, or are you speaking always? Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, proceeds Mr. Bucket, who delights in a full title and does violence to himself when he dispenses with any fragment of it. The last point in the case, which I am now going to mention, shows the necessity of patience in our business. I watched this young woman yesterday without her knowledge when she was looking at a funeral. At the funeral, in company with my wife, who planned to take her there, and I had so much to convict her, and I saw such an expression in her face, and my mind so rose against her malice toward her ladyship, and the time was altogether such a time for bringing down what you may call retribution upon her, that, if I had been a younger hand with less experience, I should have taken her certain. Equally last night, when her ladyship come home, looking, why, Lord, a man might almost say like Venus rising from the ocean, it was so unpleasant and inconsistent to think of her being charged with murder, of which she was innocent, that I felt quite to want to put an end to the job. What should I have lost, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet? I should have lost the weapon. My prisoner here proposed to Mrs. Bucket after the departure of the funeral that they should go, per bus, a little ways into the country and take tea at a very decent house of entertainment. Now, near that house of entertainment there's a piece of water. At tea my prisoner got up to fetch her pocket-handkerchief from the bedroom where the bonnets were. She was a rather long time gone, and came back a little out of wind. As soon as they came home, this was reported to me by Mrs. Bucket, along with her observations and suspicions. I had the piece of water dragged by moonlight in presence of a couple of our men, and the pocket pistol was brought up before it had been half a dozen hours. Now, my dear, put your arm a little further through mine and hold it steady, and I shan't hurt you. In a trice, Mr. Bucket snaps the handcuff on her wrist. That's one, says Mr. Bucket. Now the other, darling. Two, and all told. He rises, she rises too. Let me put your shawl tidy. I've been lady's maid to a good many before now. Anything wanting to the bonnet? There's a cab by the door. Mademoiselle Hortense, casting an indignant eye at the glass, shakes herself perfectly neat in one shake, and looks, to do her justice, uncommonly genteel. Listen then, my angel, says she, after several sarcastic nods. You are very spiritual. Can you restore him back to life? Mr. Bucket answers, not exactly. That is droll. Listen yet one time. You are very spiritual. Can you make an honourable lady of her? Don't be so malicious, says Mr. Bucket. Or a haughty gentleman of him, cries Mademoiselle, referring to Sir Leicester with ineffable disdain. Eh? Oh, then regard him, the poor infant. Ha, ha, ha! Come. Why, this is worse parleying than the other, says Mr. Bucket. Come along. You cannot do these things? Then you can do as you please with me. But it is but the death. It is all the same. Let us go, my angel. Adieu, you old man. Grey, I pity you. I despise you. With these last words, she snaps her teeth together as if her mouth closed with a spring. It is impossible to describe how Mr. Bucket gets her out, but he accomplishes that feat in a manner so peculiar to him, self-enfolding and pervading her like a cloud, and hovering away with her as if he were a homely Jupiter, and she the object of his affections. Sir Leicester, left alone, remains in the same attitude, as though he were listening and his attention were still occupied. At length he gazes round the empty room, and finding it deserted, rises unsteadily to his feet, pushes back his chair, and walks a few steps, supporting himself by the table. Then he stops, and with more of those inarticulate sounds, lifts up his eyes and seems to stare at something. Heaven knows what he sees, The green woods of Chesney Wold, the noble house, the pictures of his forefathers, strangers defacing them, thousands of fingers pointing at him, thousands of faces sneering at him. But if such shadows flit before him in his bewilderment, there is one other shadow which he can name with something like distinctness, even yet, and to which alone he addresses his tearing of his white hair and his extended arms. It is she, in association with whom, saving that she had been for years a main fiber of the root of his dignity and pride, he has never had a selfish thought. It is she whom he has loved, admired, honored, and set up for the world to respect. It is she who, at the core of all the constrained formalities and conventionalities of his life, has been a stock of living tenderness and love, susceptible as nothing else is to being struck with the agony he feels. He sees her almost to the exclusion of himself, and cannot bear to look upon her cast down from the high place she has graced so well, and, even to the point of his sinking to the ground, oblivious to his suffering, he can yet pronounce her name with something like distinctness in the midst of those intrusive sounds, and in a tone of mourning and compassion rather than reproach. And that is the end of chapter 54.